Okay, so we're going to shift gears here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Folie à deux, which we also can think of as shared psychosis, traumatic entrapment, mass hysteria, and a little bit at the end about group psychology, because I think, you know, you should learn a little bit about group psychology, which has something to do with these things. And again, remember, one of the things I told you, the theme of this class is how gullible we are as human beings. How incredibly gullible, how easily we're changed to go along with whatever the crowd, whatever the group is doing, because this, for our primate ancestors, had survival value. And so the programming to do that really continues with us. And you can really see this in society today. You don't have to look very far, you know, that we're so susceptible to political campaigns and to advertising and propaganda and all these kind of things, and even to the point where it leads us to do horrendous things to one another. And again, those of you guys who can take the Nazi Germany class will talk a lot about all the horrendous things that people do. But this has a lot to do with human group psychology and how we've evolved to live in groups. Okay? And anything outside the group is suspect, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, we tend to go along with whoever is the leader of the group. And again, you can see this kind of behavior just if you look around and, you know, among our society today. Okay, so it's not something that is removed or is out there, but is something that is very, very prevalent, but you have to look for it. Okay, and my hope is by talking to you about this that you get a little social inoculation, and that maybe you're a little bit harder to brainwash, a little bit harder to, you know, to convince about some crazy idea, that you're a little more hardened against propaganda and advertising, which we are marinated in as a society. Okay? So let's talk first of all about cults, because cults are the big example of this. People like to talk about this all the time. Cults are kind of interesting because you see people in groups, you know, who are attached to the group somehow and somehow cut off from the outside world. And this seems to be sort of they're the sort of poster child of the stuff that I'm talking about. You know, this weird human behavior in group. However, I will make the case, and I want to make this later on, that you can look at larger groups as cults as well. And again, you know, I point to the Nazi Germany class. You know, Germans under the Nazi leadership, you know, in some way, you know, behave as if they're in a cult, even though it's a national cult. And you can even think of nation states to some degree as cults. I mean, look at North Korea. You know, North Korea is kind of cult-like, right? Kind of cult-like. And so, but it's interesting to look at smaller groups of people as well, and there's a number of these. We had a lot of them in the 60s and the 70s. It seemed to be like it was sort of the sort of heyday of cults. And I can mention a couple of you guys. You may have heard of these or may not have. The Church of Euthanasia. This is a church that where this guy believes he was confronted by an alien intelligence known as the Being, who speaks for the inhabitants of Earth and other dimensions, and he warned that the ecosystem is failing and that if people really want to kill themselves, we should encourage that. So that's their cult. Okay? And you can go in, here's the website. But by the way, I'm not encouraging anybody to believe in these cults and follow these cults, okay? Likewise, if you do follow one of these cults and that is your religion, I apologize, I'm not meaning to single you out. Your religion, perhaps, even if it's kind of cult-like, may not be any weirder than the other religions out there. So just those two caveats in mind. This one also believes believes in voluntary forms of population reduction as well, including suicide, free abortions, and sodomy as a sexual practice because it doesn't lead to children. So this is the things that they support. They also are very vegetarian. They support vegetarianism, but if you have to eat meat, they think cannibalism is a good idea. So hopefully none of you are thinking, man, that's the religion for me, I want to go join that. But maybe some of you might.
Wait, isn't sodomy like lesbians and gays?
Well, there are legal definitions of sodomy, but let's just put it this way, make it simple, because the definitions change from place to place. It is non-procreative sexual acts. Let's just put it that way. Okay. This is a weird one, the Prince Philip movement. This is a cult on the island of Tanna that worships Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, as a god, because he visited there one time. This is in Vanuatu, off the coast of Australia, and is the Yao Nanan tribe on the island. And again, this, I think Prince Philip visited one time, and so they thought he was this great guy, and so they decided to make this sort of religion around him. And apparently you can go there and they have pictures of him and stuff. The Raelians, you may have heard of this one. The Raelians, this is one of our alien cults. And they say, what if the thousands of UFO sightings that occur each year, one person actually met the occupant, the driver of one of these UFOs? What if this person were given information by this space being that explained the secret history of Earth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And this guy, Claude Vorilhon, who now is known as Rael, was living his passion as a race car driver and journalist, and that went on to change after his UFO encounter, and so he decided to form a religion about this. It's a very well organized religion. Here he is, all these things about him. They have an embassy. They have here's the message, okay, and again, again, not that different than other religions, but we think, a little nutty, okay. So you can go here and check this out, space alien cult, creativity movement. A couple of these. This one's very interesting. Creativity is the religion. It's also an advancement of the white race. So this is a closet white supremacy cult. By the way, you can definitely think of white supremacy people, these racists, as cults. Ku Klux Klan, certainly a cult. Okay. Again, any of these sort of white supremacy groups out there, racial groups out there, cult-like, very cult-like. Nazis, cult. Neo-Nazis, cult. Okay. The Nuwabians. Oh, that one's no longer there. That was an interesting one. We're going to get to him in a minute. All right, anyway. Cosmic people of light powers. It's another interesting one. It's kind of got a little bit of Christianity thing in there, but these angels, you believe in these angels and they come down, do all these things, give teachings, again, UFOs, angels coming from space, typical. Okay.
Dr. Volker?
Yes.
Can you still describe the Nuwabians?
I'm trying to remember. I don't remember much about it. I have to look it up.
Oh, okay.
We can go online and see if it's there online. But yeah, go online and look it up, and then you tell me about it.
Okay.
There's so many of them, I can't keep track anymore. This is the Children of God. This was a very interesting, also called Family International. This was a Christian cult that had all sorts of interesting things going on, different iterations of this. This was a supposedly Christian cult that had a message of salvation and apocalyptic stuff. So a lot of these cults, the world's going to end. You better get together with us, or you're going to end with the world. So stick with us, you'll do okay. They have a method of evangelism I like that's called flirty fishing, that use sex to show God's love and mercy and win converts, right? So if you want to get converts, just send out some people, to go and, recruit people via sex. So this is what they did, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think there was a little pedophilia in this one, as I recall. A lot of interesting things going on here. Anyway, you can read this. I won't go into a lot of detail about it. Yes?
There were just a lot of stuff in the news about the Children of God, because I guess Ray McGowan and the Phoenix brothers, River Phoenix and his brothers that were raised in the...
Oh, yeah, that's right. They were raised in one of these. That's right. Yeah. You'll hear about stuff like that. Yes?
Was there a surge in cults around the turn of the millennium?
I don't know. You seem to hear more about them, and I'll talk about some of the other ones a little bit on. I'll talk about the Heaven's Gate cult and things like that. Yeah, you hear about them because people were like, oh, the world's going to end. And so anytime the world is going to end, people think they've figured out a way to deal with it, right? Yes?
What about the 12 tribes?
The what?
The 12 tribes.
12 tribes. I don't know about that one.
They're the ones down by San Diego.
Oh, yeah? Okay. Well, again, there's probably 20 in the county that I don't know about. I mean, there's a lot of cults. right? Yes.
So the Nuwabians, they mix black supremacist ideas with worship of Egyptians and
That's
their
right.
pyramids.
That's right.
And
yes,
believe in
yes.
USOs
Yeah.
related to the Illuminati.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to say it, but thank God there's at least black supremacists out there. You know, horrible white
Makes it more
supremacists that
even.
are everywhere, you know. My God, I mean, not that belief in racial supremacy in any way, shape, or form should be condoned. And of course, again, if you take my other class, I'll talk to you a lot about how race is just a construct. It's not a real thing. It's a social construct. So again, take my 340 class. I'll talk about that kind of stuff. And again, we can argue about, you know, organized religions. Are they a cult, right? And, you know, I mean, again, to some degree, they may fit the definition, depending on, you know, which one you're following. But again, as human beings, we tend to want to get together in little groups, reinforce each other's beliefs, and sort of keep ourselves distinct from what we consider to be other or outside. And this is very, very typical of human beings. Again, I think this is partly hardwired into human behavior through evolution. Because this had a lot of survival advantage when we were primates, from our primate ancestors. Okay, well, one of the great cults, as Jim Jones said himself, we are the cult of cults. Or maybe that was the other guy. Anyway, this is one of the big cults. This was Jim Jones, the Reverend Jim Jones. And he started the People's Temple, which was based up in Northern California. And the People's Temple and Jim Jones were a cult that was very well known in the Bay Area when I was growing up. And, you know, at first they were doing all these sort of social things. They were trying to provide meals for people and doing all these kind of socially humanitarian things to people. But then he, you know, basically Jim Jones started spinning off and becoming weirder and weirder and weirder. And they moved the center of the cult down to Latin America, to a place called Guyana in South America. And there in the isolation of the jungle, he kind of goes off the hinges. And he creates this dream community called Jonestown, and they really go nuts. And in 1978, a congressman from San Francisco, Leo Ryan, goes on a fact-finding mission to the cult down in Jonestown because people had complained of human rights abuse. They said, yeah, my kid got, you know, kidnapped by these guys and they're beating him up or whatever. And so he goes down to Jonestown, and after a day, somebody tried to stab him. He decides, I better get the hell out of here. And 18 temple members wanted to also escape, and so they go and they try to get in the plane, and they're trying to take off, and they open fire on the plane, and they killed Ryan, 3 journalists, and one of the departing members, and 11 other people were injured. So this is, you know, again, cults and guns, you know, not a good mixture. They were very well armed. And what happens is that Jim Jones knows now, you know, the jig is up. You killed a U.S. congressman, that's not going to go over very well, and so what he does is he gets a big giant bathtub full of grape-flavored Kool-Aid, and he laces it with potassium cyanide and tranquilizers, and all 900-plus people in the cult were required to drink out of the bathtub. Some people did this voluntarily. They gave basically the babies and children first. They gave them poison, and then everybody would drink, and those who did not want to drink or partake were forced to drink the poison, and then all the people there died. Some people were shot by security guards trying to run away, and the ritual suicide progressed. It was unclear whether Jim Jones put a bullet through his brain or somebody did it for him, but he was found shot. Okay, and even temple members who were in other places, like living in the United States, when they found out about this, they also committed suicide. Okay? So again, this was the cult of cults when I was in college. This was, you know, this had just happened. This was a big deal. And so this was really quite present. So again, and then you can hear is the vat with the Kool-Aid here, and there's all the dead people here. Oh, I used to have a sound recording of this. I don't think I'll play it though, because nobody's feeling good enough today to listen to that. But you can go online. There's a audio recording of what's going on. Jim Jones spieling off some crazy stuff while people in the background are dying of of poisoning, and kids are screaming and yelling. It's horrendous audio, but you can find it on YouTube. It's up there. Yes.
May I tell a very dark joke about this?
Sure.
Okay.
Hopefully enough time has passed now.
Why is it a bad idea to tell a joke about the Reverend Jim Jones?
Why?
Because the punchline is too long.
Oh. So bad it's good. Yeah.
It's also where our colloquial saying, don't drink the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, don't drink the Kool-Aid comes from. Exactly, yeah. So again, one line explanation of this class. by the end of it, I hope you don't drink the Kool-Aid. So that's the idea. Let's talk about, again, some people call this mass psychosis and hysteria, but again, you think of big groups of people who get caught up in things. Cults seem to be somewhat delimited and smaller. Jones cult, obviously a large one. You can think of religions maybe as large, but we can think about mass psychosis of whole groups, really large groups of people. Okay, and this is an interesting example. This is a woman called Reem Salah al-Riyashi, who became a Palestinian martyr when she blew herself up, killing 4 Israelis at the Erez crossing point in Gaza. And this is the Palestinian, this is the suicide bomber here herself, holding her son on a Tehran wall, a big poster of her on a Tehran wall. The irony of this is that, a lot of times in places like Iran, they'll have these, big posters of these terrorists, and they'll say stuff like "Death to Israel" and all these kind of things. They obviously hate the Israelis. However, there are not many people around the world who make printers that can print large posters. One of the only countries where you can find these printers is in Israel. And so they have to actually buy the printer from Israel to print these posters that say "Death to Israel." So it's kind of ironic. So just think of that in mind. Again, you're not talking about rational thought processes here. Okay. Now, many fundamentalists, fundamentalist Iranians and other, people see her as a hero. Okay. Again, the suicide bombing is something that is. That seem to be, really good. Now, you also have to understand the Palestinians are in a bad state. They're not in a bad place. So again, I'm not going to take a stand in the Israeli-Palestinian side. You can really see, where both sides really have contributed to the problem. Okay? I think that's my view of it. And I say that as a person of ethnic Muslim descent who is married to a Jew, right? So I hear in my family, both sides of the story. And I would say, yeah, both sides are really, they're really, it's very messed up. It's a very messed up situation. It's not getting any better, by the way, just in case you were hoping that things were better. Really not much better right now, okay? Things have not happened. I'd love to be able to tell you that Jared Kushner rode in there on a white horse and just fixed the whole Middle East problem, but apparently now it looks like that instead of that happening, everybody was going, this guy's a rube and a newbie, so we're going to figure out a way to, manipulate him to get what we wanted, That was just in the news the other day. So anyway, but still a big problem there. But it does give an example of how you can sort of bring people into the view of the group. And I'll show you some of that. Yes.
I'm not sure if this is related exactly to this, but just in general, how you just said that it's not getting better.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of other academics as well, I guess, writing books and things, how it's the safest time in the world now.
Yeah.
That's probably just in comparison to what? Or to what place, what country, what time?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, this is a little bit tangential, but it's worth mentioning that if you look around the world now, and there's been some studies on this, that the world right now is probably a safer place than it's ever been. And you don't have to look back very far and realize that things were really bad. You go back like 100 years, or not 100 years, but 70 years, 80 years. And, we had World War I, we had World War II, millions upon millions of people getting killed. Society is completely disrupted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of places where there was no rule of law, people in general tended to deal with societal problems with more violence, things like that. It doesn't mean that things are great now everywhere, but yeah, historically comparatively, things are doing well. Okay, but there are hot spots in the world where things are not doing well, and the Middle East, unfortunately, has been one of those hot spots for quite a long time. And again, if you take my other classes where I teach with Dr. Bushman, him and I will make the case to some degree. This has a lot to do. A lot of times, the problem spots in the world are where we've had very intense colonialism.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the Middle East is a problem because the British, especially the British, did a lot of colonial crap all over the world, and the British came in and took over and ran things and treated people a certain way, and then when they leave, everything is destabilized and things get screwed up. And again, my father lived under British rule in the Middle East, and if you ask him, he hates the British. He absolutely hates them. But they really screwed things up. If you're Indian, you can probably trace a lot of the problems in India. the modern problems in India and Pakistan to, the British colonialization and things like that. So one thing I have, at least I've come to the conclusion myself about, is that colonialism is bad. Going and taking over people and basically, taking over their lives and forcing them to be under your control and taking all their resources and things from their place and taking it somewhere else without recompense, without fair recompense, is a bad thing. And if you look around the world, you'll see people who've been colonized. It just, the repercussions. I mean, look at Native Americans. I mean, Native Americans still suffering under the repercussions of colonization. I mean, look at Black Americans who were, really severely colonized. To the point where they were turned into slaves. That wasn't good for them. And they still feel the repercussions. And again, on and on and on and on. You can go down to Latin America and look at the Spanish colonization of Latin America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one thing, again, if you could take this out of this class, I wouldn't mind if, but again, you need to figure this out, study this, and come to the conclusion yourself. Just don't take my word for it. But colonization tends to be bad. Colonization, not a good thing, regardless of who's doing it. Okay? So I'll just show you something here. This is a little kind of disturbing. This is a children's show in Palestine.
لما تفضل تفضلي يلا حيونا زكوا معها يلا بيكم طيبة يلا لا 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 تقول علينا صوت من هذا الكاسين أكبر من غير فلسطين شو يعني سهولة من غير فلسطين شو يعني سهولة لو يعطونا الدنيا وما لا لا ما تنسينا لا 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 توجد في كلمة لا من غير فلسطين شو يعني سهولة من غير فلسطين شو يعني سهولة.
So that should be a little frightening, hopefully. And it really points out something that is universal about cults and brainwashing people in large groups, and that is that you go for the children. You want to brainwash people, you go for the children. Yes?
Does this constitute like a definition of child abuse?
Depends on what your, on what your reference point is, I mean, I think, encouraging children to become martyrs, kill themselves for their nation is a little bit weird. But I mean, you think about what I should do is I should contrast this with maybe an ad for joining the U.S. Army or something, where again you are encouraging young people, not children, but young people to go out and fight for their country. And again, it brings up the whole idea of national identity. Again, we don't have time to talk about it in this class, but this idea of identification with the nation state, right? And I do talk about this in the World War I class a bit. I got a little bit more lecture on this stuff, but it's really quite interesting. And again, again, I'm not going to blame the Palestinians. I mean, it's bad, but here's give you an idea of the other side.
Outside Bethlehem's hospital earlier this month, Ismail Hawaja sat sick with grief. The Israelis had killed his wife, Huda, he told CBC, with an explosion at their home. As is often the case, his story of abuse by soldiers couldn't be verified. The army had nothing to say, and what was happening inside the refugee camp was off limits to foreign reporters. but not to the Israeli media. An Israeli camera went right along with the soldiers, right into the briefings, and right into the Hawaja home. The army blew off the door, and inside found Huda Hawaja mortally wounded on the floor. Ismail Hawaja clearly thought at that point his wife would live. He begged the army to let an ambulance through. There were delays. The camera captured the terror of the woman's young daughter and her brother's attempt to stop her from showing the soldiers her fear. After the mother was finally taken out, one of the soldiers spoke to the news crew. I don't know what we're doing here, he said. Purification, maybe. It's dirty here. I don't know why a good Hebrew boy should be here so far from his home. Another soldier said he approved of the operation and that it really wasn't so bad. The soldiers then tore the house apart, evidently looking for weapons. In another scene, a girl begged soldiers not to demolish her home's wall, but in vain. Soldiers commonly smash walls to get into adjacent houses. This tape was actually not supposed to be aired. The arrangement is this. All three networks here agree that if the Army doesn't like what's filmed, the footage is never broadcast. In this case, the Army decided this tape was too embarrassing, too damaging, so it ordered it shelved. But this past weekend, Israel's Channel 2 decided to break the embargo. And the Army and the government and a lot of viewers did not like what they saw. So, on the one side...
Okay, so you get the idea here, you know, I mean, so again, you know, it's messed up on both sides. You know, I mean, and so I'm not taking one side or the other here. But again, you know, this is, you know, can be an idea you can think of as sort of a, you know, mass psychosis here, where you're really, you know, indoctrinating people. And again, you know, if you really want to indoctrinate people to a message, you start with the children. And again, the Nazis knew this. You know, the Nazis put a lot of effort into indoctrinating the children. They had the Hitler Youth and, you know, these kind of things. You get them when they're really young, and by the time they get to, you know, to be adults, they are completely brainwashed to a certain sort of viewpoint. Yes.
I can even argue that even McDonald's, like Happy Meals, start them at a young age and you'll have a customer for
Yes.
life.
Advertisers know this exactly. Yes. Yeah. You look at McDonald's commercials, you'll see all the things that are geared toward
The toys.
the kids, and you know, something that's very, you know, unhealthful. Right, you know, we used to have cigarette ads on TV. You guys are probably too young to remember this. We had cigarette ads on TV. The cigarette ads were found to be geared toward kids. Because if you get kids hooked early on, it's much harder for them to quit smoking cigarettes. And so a lot of the cigarette ads were found to be, you know, targeted at kids. And of course, this is one of the reasons why they were able to get them banned from TV, so you don't see cigarette ads anymore. But again, yeah, advertisers are you know, they know this as well. Okay? So again, when you see stuff being advertised, especially to kids, you know, you take it with a grain of salt. Yes.
My family friend, her brother was Hitler Youth, and he found out that his family was hiding a Jewish lawyer in the basement, and he was ready to turn the family,
Yeah.
and he tried to, so they locked him in the house
Yeah.
and said, you're not
Yeah.
allowed to leave. And even until, like, it wasn't until, like, a year before he died, he was still adamant that his parents
Yeah.
were wrong for what
Yeah,
happened.
it was very common that people would turn in neighbors and people would turn in family members, and you know, these especially these kids are very indoctrinated. Yeah. In fact, the teachers had a really hard time in Nazi Germany because they were all Hitler Youth, and they thought the teacher was going off saying anything even remotely critical of the Nazis. They would report them, and the teacher, you know, be sent off the next day. You know, and so that was very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, we can think about this in terms of a mental illness, and it's in the DSM-4. I don't know if this made it over the DSM-5 or not. I should probably check on that. But it's something that was called shared psychotic disorder, and this is sort of an extreme example of the kind of things I'm talking about. And this is a delusion that develops in an individual in context of a close relationship with another person or persons. And these are the person or person who already has an established delusion, already established psychosis. And the delusion in the new person is similar in content to the person who's already established the delusion. And disturbance is not better accounted for by another psychotic disorder, meaning that the new person is not schizophrenic or has a mood disorder or something else that would point to a problem. Okay? It's more frequent in women, also found in men. And it's usually involved in individuals who have usually close relationship who are isolated from others. And usually you'll find like women like a mother and daughter or two sisters or something like this. And again, you guys read that Satan article. That's a very good example of this. Okay, and gives you an idea about this. And so there's a number of reports in the thing. And again, you have somebody who's schizophrenic and they're isolated with, and somebody normal is isolated with them for a period of time. And then the normal person will start showing the signs of the same delusion that the schizophrenic person will have. How do you know that they're not really schizophrenic? Well, when you separate them, the original person remains schizophrenic, but the person who was associated with them goes back to normal. And again, this is sort of a little bit of a natural experiment about how gullible we are. Even if you are locked up with a schizophrenic person, you'll start believing the same weird delusions as that person. Okay? And again, this had survival value. Especially if that person with the delusion is more of the alpha person, they're more of the high status person, you'll start to share the same delusions. And again, this is a known thing. So again, when you think about religions and cults and mass hysteria, I think this is sort of to some degree this may be a shared, it's like a shared psychosis to some degree. And think about some of the religions out there. Some of the beliefs are really crazy. Not to pick on the Scientologists, but they're close by. They're an interesting example. That these aliens came down and, Daytons and they inhabited people and all this kind of stuff. There really is no observable evidence for this. But yet this is, these people have a very strong belief in this kind of thing. And I could pick on more established religions as well. That would also be easy to do. I don't want to offend anybody, so I can pick on the Scientologists. I'm assuming most of you don't have enough money to belong to Scientology, but maybe there might be somebody who do. Scientology is very expensive. Yes?
Where does gaslighting fit into it?
It's also very similar, that you can fool people, and we're seeing this now on the internet, right? You can gaslight people, you can catfish people, and people, they especially if the person, is, perceived to be, somehow at a higher, status. That we'll tend to go with whatever they want us to do, right? So again, we're seeing these versions of this, played out on the internet now. Now the internet now is changing the way we think about groups of people, so that you can be in a group in the internet now as opposed to actually being in a physical place. You can also be isolated with people on the internet. And so all these things are coming out, and these are probably going to lead to variants of a lot of the disorders that we're talking about now. Okay? And so this will be, unfortunately for you guys, but fortunately, if you go into clinical psychology, this will be a new area that you'll be able to work in because there's going to be a lot of this stuff. Yes?
I heard that with the Columbine shooters, only one of them, when they looked through his records, had signs of schizotypal or psychopathy.
We're going to talk about them, so hold on to that thought. One guy was a pretty typical psychopath, and the other guy was kind of depressed.
But they were isolated.
And one guy basically gets sort of pulled into the psychopath sort of thing. We'll talk about that, and it would fit this. It would fit this kind of thing. Yeah.
That's sort of the DC shooter, though.
What's that?
The DC snipers.
The DC snipers, yeah, similar to that, yeah. Another very good example of that, yeah. Because the kid was just kind of going along with this adult, and you're with him all the time, so you start to believe what he believes. Again, very common. And again, I had really not to do much, but control you guys a little bit. It's very easy to do this. Very easy to brainwash people to do things. Yes.
So in the reading it said that shared psychosis is mainly found among family members that are blood relatives.
Yeah.
What is that?
Mainly family members, not always, but I mean these Folie Deux cases. Typically, it's the mother and a daughter, very typical, or two sisters. But there are cases where there's men, as well. But yeah, this is the typical thing, and they tend to be isolated out somewhere, And then one is schizophrenic.
Do they think it has something to do with genetics?
It could be. I mean, you could. The person. I mean, it doesn't get diagnosed if the person is normal. When they remove them, and the one person, the daughter becomes normal again. The mother's still schizophrenic, but it may be that there's some incipient psychosis. I don't think there's been enough cases where they've really teased that out really well. That'd be another good thing for graduate school to look into. Another good study to do. Tease that out. Yes.
There was a recent BBC article that I read had a situation where it was a daughter whose mother had left a bad relationship, and met a guy, and the guy convinced her that the mafia was after him and such, and she had spent her whole life being moved around in just safe places.
Yeah. These kind of things a lot of them don't rise to the point where they get They get to the attention of the authorities. You know, there's a lot, I mean, one thing you can think of is like child abuse is a form of shared psychosis. You know, people who stay in abusive relationships with a child abuser. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. We're going to talk about traumatic entrapment. This is where it now gets into a more general category, where we see lots of this stuff. But the same mechanism probably underlying it. Okay? So again, I'll let you guys read some of these ideas here. Case reports. So let's move on and talk about traumatic entrapment syndrome. You guys know this by its vernacular name, Stockholm Syndrome. And again, one of the poster people of this is Patty Hearst, who was kidnapped, raped, brainwashed, and then took on the values and the behaviors of her tormentors. We're talking about traumatic entrapment syndrome, otherwise known as Stockholm Syndrome. And this is a syndrome that was coined by criminologist and psychiatrist Niels Bergerot in relation to the robbery of a bank in Stockholm, Sweden in 1973. And during this bank robbery, bank employees were held hostage for 6 days there in the bank with the robbers, you can see here. And they began to experience a number of positive emotions, including loyalty, empathy, and love toward the robbers, even defending their actions after they were freed. And we think of Stockholm Syndrome as a psychological response by people, usually but not always female, because men have this too, who've been abducted and held for some period of time. When Stockholm Syndrome develops, hostages begin to have positive feelings of loyalty, empathy, sympathy, even love toward their abductors. This occurs in spite of immediate danger, loss of freedom, sexual abuse, and extreme cases, torture. It's been seen in very many various degrees and in many different types of hostage-taking situations, including bank robbery, rape, domestic violence, child abuse, long-term abduction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so over the years, there's been a number of cases of abduction where Stockholm Syndrome has been confirmed or suspected. And I'll give you we're going to go through a bunch of these different cases. It's by no means an exhaustive list. So we could think of other cases as well as the ones I'm going to show you, but these tend to be very dramatic, so I figured I'd show you these ones. Yes?
Was that the first known case in Stockholm?
That's the first known one where somebody in the mental health system, as far as I know, wrote about it. I'm sure there's been other cases before. I think it's been around as long as we've had humans, and maybe even among primates. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the end, okay? So let me give you a couple different cases here. These are kind of horrific. So I apologize, it's not fun stuff to talk about, but again, it's probably a good thing for you guys to know about. Okay? So talking about Stephen Strainer, this was a kid who was kidnapped in Merced, California by a guy named Kenneth Parnell in 1972. He was held captive over 7 years until early 1980. And Parnell at that time then abducted another kid, a 5-year-old boy, and Strainer decided to escape in order to return the boy to his parents. While Strainer was at work, he left while Parnell or Strainer was at work, he left the boy with Strainer, and Strainer took the boy and went to the police. Parnell was arrested. He was only sentenced to 7 years. He was paroled after 5. So this is where you have to think about, laws and laws for these kind of things. The laws for these kind of things have gotten a lot tougher. I don't know about this specific situation, but the laws are a lot tougher now. Back in the day, a lot of these crimes didn't get that much time for it. You could get, again, if you go back to the 70s, you can find people who probably got more time for being caught with some marijuana on them, than somebody, raping and abducting somebody for years and years and years. So really kind of a little crazy, okay? So Parnell got out, but at 72, Parnell is now old and decrepit. He attempts to get his nurse to procure a boy for him, and she reported him to the police, and he was returned to prison where he died in 2008. Stephen Strainer was killed in a motorcycle accident in 1989. His life was pretty screwed up afterward. And here he is with the boy here. One of those famous cases involving Stockholm Syndrome is Patty Hearst. She was an heiress of the Hearst family fortune. She was kidnapped February 4th, 1974 by the radical Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA. Again, I lived up in the Bay Area at this time. That's where I was growing up, and I remember this was a big deal. So it was in the news constantly, and people were a little freaked out about the SLA. Patty was abducted, and she was kept in a closet, systematically brainwashed, physically and sexually abused, chiefly by Donald DeFries, whose alias was Sing Q, the leader of the SLA, and later by another guy, Willie Wolf, whose name, his SLA name was Cujo. And so by physical and sexual abuse, I mean she was beaten up regularly and she was raped regularly. Although it has been asserted that Patty willingly had romantic relationships with these SLA members, she has steadfastly maintained that this was not true. After a failed attempt to ransom Patty Hearst, this involved the distribution of food to poor people, something that those of us raised in the San Francisco Bay Area will never forget. She soon issued a communique calling herself Tanya in honor of Che Guevara's partner, saying that she was now part of the SLA. Shortly thereafter, Tanya showed up on surveillance cameras during a bank robbery at the Sunset District of San Francisco holding an M1 rifle. After the ringleaders of the SLA were killed in a massive shootout in Los Angeles, other SLA members robbed the bank in Carmichael, California, and killed a bank customer. So you guys don't remember this, because all this gun control law and school shootings, this is what we think about now. We think about mass shootouts. But back in the day, in the 70s, there were mass shootouts of bank robberies, and these SLA guys would go in these, they would go in the bank, the cops would show up, they'd have a massive shootout with these guys. And there's some video of it, you can find some video of it online. It's pretty horrendous stuff. And so there was another bank robbery, and they ended up killing a bank customer. And Tanya was not inside the bank at the time. She was supposedly in one of the getaway cars. She was arrested very soon after. And at the time, you guys may have heard of Johnny Cochran, who was in the OJ case, the lawyer. He was very infamous. Well, back in the day, there was another lawyer named F. Lee Bailey, who was he was kind of like this Johnny Cochran of the day, and Patty Hearst's family hired him as an attorney. But he made a big mistake. He did not have a class like this, and he did not know about Stockholm Syndrome. And so that was not really part of Patty Hearst's defense. And he did not make a great case for Patty having been brainwashed or having suffered from Stockholm Syndrome. And partly because of this, at least, this is why she got convicted. Okay? And she also refused to testify against the other SLA members, but again, if you understood about Stockholm Syndrome, that would make sense. She was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to 35 years in prison. She served 2 years of her sentence before it was commuted by then President Jimmy Carter, who actually, for all his political problems, not very well liked, was a smart guy, and realized that this really was a case where she had some kind of Stockholm Syndrome. After her release from prison, she married her former bodyguard and had 2 children. She's had a minor but interesting career in the entertainment industry, appearing in films by John Waters. You guys know John Waters, the filmmaker. I think she was in the movie Serial Mom. If you saw that movie, it's a pretty funny movie. John Waters is a pretty interesting guy, too. We should have a whole lecture on him. She wrote an autobiography titled Patty Hearst, Her Story, and there have been numerous other books written about her as well. In 1999, she was given a pardon by Bill Clinton as one of his last acts in office. So she was let out of prison by Carter, but she still has the conviction in her record. It wasn't until 1999 the conviction was actually expunged by the pardon. Okay, so they're different things. It's good to know. A lot of times presidents leaving office, this is the kind of things they will do. Somebody will give them a big long laundry list of all these people who've been, wrongly jailed or whatever, and then they'll go through and they'll decide which ones to actually have. So she was actually pardoned by Bill Clinton. Now, Colleen Stan is another woman, and Colleen Stan is not really her real name. There's a lot of information about her. There's a book written about her called Perfect Victim, The True Story of a Girl in a Box. And we'll talk a little about her. And by the way, this is also an admonition to you guys about hitchhiking. Back when I was in college, hitchhiking was very, very common. Everybody hitchhiked. Okay? I hitchhiked off campus to go downtown. I hitchhiked back. I hitchhiked in the middle of the night. My female friends hitchhiked. One of my female friends was raped hitchhiking, unfortunately. It was very, very common. I lived in a dormitory floor with a guy, and his girlfriend was hitchhiking, and never was heard from again until a couple years later when they found the remnants of her body out in the woods. So hitchhiking, relatively dangerous. It was very common back in the day. We don't really see much of it now. You guys see many hitchhikers now? Every once in a while. Not very common now. I don't know, maybe that'll change once everybody has concealed carry permits and you're all packing heat every minute of the day. Maybe it'll be okay. Of course, your hitchhiker, your guy picking you up hitchhiking will also be packing heat. I don't know. But this is a good, interesting story, not a good story. Colleen Stan was hitchhiking in Northern California in May 1977 when a car pulled over and offered her a ride. She looked in the car, she saw there was a man, his wife, and a little baby. She thought, oh, this is a safe ride. I'll get in the car. So she got in the car. At one point, the guy, people were really nice to her. He said, oh, I have to go off into the wilderness area. He turned off a road going way out in the middle of the wilderness area. And she's like, why are you going here? Oh, I just have to go pick something up. Okay, no big deal, because I can trust a family with a little baby. Well, at one point, the guy driving the car, his name was Hooker, stops the car, and he holds Colleen at knife point, and he places a specially made wooden box that fits over her head and blocks out all, visual senses and everything. And she was bound, gagged, stuffed into a sleeping bag, and kept out of sight for the drive to his remote home. Once there, Colleen was almost immediately tortured, hung by her arms, and beaten. This aroused Hooker so much, he called in his wife, and they had sex at the feet of this bound, tortured woman. Colleen was then locked in another box, and the head box was placed over her again. She could barely breathe. When she started to scream, Hooker placed her on a constricting band around her chest, making it even harder for her to breathe. She felt as if she was going to die. When she didn't die and some of the restrictions were removed, she was relieved, and the brainwashing had begun. She was forced to lie under their bed at night. They made a kind of coffin-like thing that went under. They had a water bed, because back in the 70s, everybody had a water bed. You guys don't remember that. But under the bed, they had this box, and she was forced to lie. This is a recreation from the court. When they were doing the case, they brought all this stuff in, and she was forced to lie under the bed. And for the next 7 years, Colleen would live the life of a sex slave. For the first 3 years, she would only be allowed out of the box an hour a day. She'd be placed in a coffin-like box every night, which is under Hooker's bed, and tortured on a regular basis. She was told if she escaped a sex slave ring named the company would kill her family. Another very common thing. Okay? Very common thing. Hooker had done his homework on brainwashing and used isolation, starvation, severe beating, torture, and bathroom privileges, surprisingly enough, and sexual abuse to bring her to a state of complete subservience. Bathroom privileges are a big deal because we have a lot of feelings of shame around human elimination, eliminating our bowels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you can sort of restrict people's ability to go to the bathroom, you can actually, more easily brainwash them because people will feel ashamed when they soil themselves. And so again, by removing that, next time letting them go to the bathroom, then they start to feel a little gratitude towards you, and you can brainwash them. As she had more and more brainwashed, she was given more and more freedom and was allowed to do chores around the house. While Hooker molested Colleen, he never had intercourse with her. One day after he tried to have a menage a trois with Colleen and his wife, Hooker raped Colleen for the first time. He then raped her on a regular basis thereafter. Here's one of the boxes shown in court. Again, her head would have been stuffed in here. It had insulation on the inside. She would have been isolated. This is the chain that was used to tie her up and string her out like on a rack. They blocked out the body. This is a court picture. This would have been her body. And Hooker took pictures of all this stuff, by the way. This is actually Colleen stretched out on the rack here. And they blotted out her body for the court. But you can see this is the torture device. Okay. She would be stretched out like this for many hours. Another photo that survived is this one, her stretched out. Now, Hooker took a lot of pictures, which was kind of, to some degree, his downfall, because he tried, when the jig was up and he knew that he was going to be, thought he might be arrested, he tried to destroy all the pictures, but apparently there were so many that he couldn't get rid of all of them, so a lot of them survived. Colleen was eventually allowed to work in the yard and even go jogging. In 1980, Hooker allowed his wife, Janice, to take Colleen to a bar where they picked up some men. He even allowed Janice to carry on an affair with one of them. Eventually, Colleen was allowed to write letters to her family, call them by the phone, and finally visit them. During the visit, she introduced Hooker to her family as her computer programmer boyfriend. After this visit, Hooker confined Colleen to her box for the next 3 years. She's worried. She's starting to get might get some independent ideas. Though he did allow her out of work as a maid in a local hotel. Janice, this is the wife, who had been reading the Bible, began to have misgivings about the situation, including the sexual activities of her husband, that her husband was forcing her to have sex with Colleen. She did not like that. So Janice picked up Colleen from work and encouraged her to escape. The next day, Colleen quit her job and fled, returning to her parents' home. Once home, Colleen did not tell her story to anyone and stayed in touch with Janice. She assured Hooker she would not go to the police. Hooker obviously expected to be arrested and started getting rid of any evidence. Colleen began to tell her family some of what she'd been through. They urged her to call the authorities. In the meantime, Janice left Hooker and confessed to her pastor. She got religion. Confessed to her pastor. The pastor then called the police. The police agreed to give Janice immunity for testifying against Hooker. She told about another woman who Hooker had abducted and shot, as well as Colleen. Hooker was finally arrested on charges of sodomy, kidnap, rape, and various other crimes. Again, here's some more of the devices he had. Unlike Patty Hearst's lawyers, the prosecutor in this case called in experts on brainwashing and Stockholm Syndrome to the courtroom. In the courtroom, the fact that Colleen had written 29 love letters to Hooker came out. Yet there was no doubt she had developed Stockholm Syndrome. This was completely shown to be the result of the treatment at the hands of her kidnapper. Hooker was found guilty of 10 charges, including kidnapping and rape, was sentenced to 104 years in prison, where supposedly remains to this day. Somebody told me he's since died, but I don't know if that's true or not. Could look that up. Colleen has tried to have a normal life afterward. She went to therapy, got married, divorced, had a daughter. She volunteers for a sex abuse hotline and warns young people about the dangers of hitchhiking. Yikes. Another case, 1990, young man named Fusako Sano, a young girl named Fusako Sano, age 10, was kidnapped in Niigata Prefecture in Japan, held captive for 9 years until the year 2000 by a mentally disturbed man, Nobuyuki Sato, who lived in a room above his mother's house. Sano said she gave up the idea of escape because she was fearful. Nobuyuki eventually caused trouble for his mother, who called the police. Sano revealed herself to the police when they came to the room where she lived with her captor. It's a woman named Sabine Dardenne. She was kidnapped in 1996 while biking to school in Belgium when she was 12 years old. Her abductor, Marc Dutroux, was a psychopath and serial murderer. She was held captive for 80 days in the basement. Dutroux had murdered a number of previous victims and an accomplice. He owned 7 houses in which he housed his victims and used pharmaceutical drugs to subdue them. Sabine would likely have been murdered if Dutroux had not been apprehended by the police. Dutroux was sentenced to life imprisonment, and his former wife and other accomplices also received long sentences. This is like a whole ring of people. And she wrote a book about this called I Choose to Live. Another book, Natasha Kampuch, the subject of a book called The Girl in the Cellar, tells the ordeal of a 10-year-old Natasha who was abducted in 1998 while walking to school in Vienna. Her abductor, Wolfgang Priklopil, kept her in captivity for 8 years in a cellar she was told was rigged with explosives. Her captor insisted the victims that she address him as master, and was the only other person Natasha was allowed to interact with during this time. Not surprisingly, she became dependent on him. Though he beat and likely sexually abused her, he provided her with basic necessities of life, but really no more. Over the years, she was allowed more and more freedom. Even though the captor threatened to kill her, she tried to escape at age 18. She finally summoned the will to escape when her captor took a phone call and left her alone while she was cleaning his car. And she ran away. She found an elderly neighbor next door who called the police. Priklopil knew the jig was up, so he went to the train station and jumped in front of a train. Natasha was reunited with her parents, but she had a lot of problems with her parents. She'd had problems before as a kid, and now they're even worse. And so she didn't want to live with them. She couldn't get along with them. She excoriated by the public who did not understand why she didn't escape earlier and seemed attached to her captor. Again, people didn't understand the Stockholm Syndrome. And she finally, a very interesting thing, her captor had, this property, and he didn't, but he had no heirs. And so after he died, she ended up inheriting the house. And so she decided just to go live back in the house that she had been held as a captive. And they asked her about it. She said, well, this is the only real home I know. And they gave her a TV show, short-lived TV show, like where she was like a talk show host, like Jay Leno or somebody. I mean, or Stephen Colbert. That didn't work very well, right? And so finally, she just decided to live alone and has a real intense phobia of the outside world. Just lives alone as a recluse, a shut-in. Okay? Very interesting. Still like kind of a prisoner in the same house. Very interesting. Very sad. Yes.
So is she, for all intents and purposes, an agoraphobic?
Yeah. Intense phobia. Yeah.
Can you explain what that is?
That's a fear of, agoraphobia is fear of open places. Agora means market. So, Agora Hills, Market Hills. Agoraphobia is market. And so but it means anybody who's afraid to sort of go outside, be in open space. There's another case, another horrific case, 2000, 17-year-old Lena Simakina and 14-year-old Katya Martyanova were abducted by an ex-army officer and factory worker, Viktor Mokov. The girls were kept as sex slaves in the basement for 3.5 years. Lena was impregnated twice and gave birth only with the assistance of her young friend. The babies were taken from her and abandoned. Both girls unsuccessfully tried to resist him during the ordeal. Eventually, they were able to smuggle out a note which led to the downfall of their tormentor. Lena was 8 months pregnant when she was finally freed. Mokov was sentenced to 17 years in a labor camp and 2 years in prison. So again, 17 years in a labor camp, at least in the old Soviet Union, that probably would have been a death sentence. I don't know about modern Soviet Union. But again, it seems a little bit of a light sentence to me. There's another woman you may have heard of, Elizabeth Smart. 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped, repeatedly raped by psychotic religious fanatic Brian David Mitchell with the help of his wife, Wanda. Initially, Smart was kept in close confinement and was allowed more and more freedom as time went on. She was found with a couple in March of 2003. Elizabeth may not have suffered from Stockholm Syndrome as much. She obviously did a little bit, and she may not have escaped for so long out of fear because Mitchell had threatened to kill her family, and Mitchell had known her family. She kept a journal during her captivity written in French where she wrote how much she hated her captors. After her escape, she became an advocate for those who have suffered from abduction. Bright and capable Elizabeth has been able to hold her own with obnoxious media pundits. I'd like to show you the obnoxious media people because there's really some obnoxious people.
Elizabeth, I remember when you first went missing and literally hundreds of people were out looking for you. Now we know you were being held captive not very far away from your home at all. Did you ever hear people calling out your name trying to find you?
There was one time.
At that moment, did you want to scream out, "Here I am, help me"?
I mean, of course, who wouldn't?
How, at that moment, when you knew people were looking for you, your parents were there, they were trying to find you, how did that make you feel?
You know, I didn't know how big it was, and it was good to know people were looking for me, but I felt so far away, you know, it didn't really connect at that time, and you know, and I think that.
And you were such a little girl, Elizabeth. I mean, you were just 14 years old.
Yeah.
It's hard to expect a little 14-year-old girl to react the way an adult might imagine they would react under those circumstances. You were afraid, I assume.
Yeah.
Did your kidnappers tell you they would hurt you or your family if you tried to get away?
You know, they did. And I really am here to support the bill and not to go into what happened to me, what is in my past, because I'm not here to give an interview on that. I'm here to help push this bill through.
And I want you to push the bill through, and I want people to hear your voice. When we take a look back, there is a shot of Elizabeth Smart, and here she is 4 years later, and frankly, it's a miracle that she was ever found. You know, a lot of people have seen shots of you wearing a burqa. How did you see out of that thing?
You know, I'm really not going to talk about this at this time. I mean, that's something I just don't even look back at, and I really, to be frankly honest, I really don't appreciate you bringing all this up.
I'm sorry, dear. I thought that you would speak out to other victims, but you know what? I completely understand. A lot of victims don't want to talk about it and don't feel like talking about it. Let's talk about the bill. To Senator Hatch. Senator Hatch, you said you wanted...
So there you go. Very smart, very capable young woman. She's still around now. She's still doing activism work. Very, very impressive that she was able to, you know, overcome this horrific, you know, trauma. And you know, gosh, I mean, if you really wanted somebody to be kidnapped, maybe Nancy Grace, you know, needs to be, you know, she's really annoying. I mean, that's just really annoying. And but you know, she just stood right up to her. You know, I mean, this is how clear-headed she is about things. Very, very impressive young woman. Another one, Shawn Hornbeck. This is another one, and kidnapped at age 11 in 2003, held by 4 years by a guy named Michael Devlin in Missouri. He was repeatedly molested. Shawn began using Devlin's last name, even though he spoke to police on 2 separate occasions on unrelated matters, did not really reveal his true identity. Finally discovered when police received a tip. They were searching for another recently missing boy, Ben Ownby, who had also been abducted by Devlin. Incredibly, some of the media, such as commentator Bill O'Reilly, again, no offense if you love Bill O'Reilly, but I'm going to really call him out on this one, have blamed Shawn for his captivity, questioning why he did not speak up earlier and trying to escape. To my mind, this demonstrates a monumental level of ignorance and callousness as the nature and effects of Stockholm Syndrome. Again, you can see Bill O'Reilly here giving his opinion about Stockholm
honors the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
And here you even have his co-commentator, Greta Van Susteren, you know, is shocked by O'Reilly's comments. Now I'll play all this.
Impact segment tonight, disturbing case of the 2 kidnapped boys in Missouri. As you know, police found 15-year-old Shawn Hornbeck in an apartment of 41-year-old Michael Devlin last week, along with 13-year-old Ben Ownby. Both boys had allegedly been kidnapped by Devlin, who ran a pizza place in the town of Kirkwood. Shawn had been missing for 4 years, and the question is, why didn't he escape when he could have? There are all kinds of theories about that. Joining us now from Washington, Greta Van Susteren, who had been out to Missouri reporting on the case. All right, you know, the Stockholm Syndrome thing, I don't buy it. I've never bought it. I didn't think it happened in the Patty Hearst case. I don't think it happened here. 2 late developments.
Can I say one thing in response to that? Is that, first of all, you know, we don't know exactly, we don't know all the facts, but don't forget that Elizabeth Smart likewise had an opportunity to leave and did not. She was on the public street. For some reason, when young people are picked up and taken under the influence of adults, they are very receptive to what the adults do. So I would not so quickly dismiss the Stockholm. And remember, he was a kid when he was picked up. He's 11.
Okay, but the difference in the Smart case, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this guy was always hovering around the little girl, and she wasn't gone for the long period of time as this guy was. Now, what we have learned, and this is why I don't believe in the Stockholm Syndrome, that this guy, Shawn Hornbeck, gone 4 years, 11 to 15, authorities actually say he taunted his own parents on their website. He you know, has got the piercings. I mean, this is a troubled kid.
The piercings, I mean, like a lot of kids do piercings and don't do things like that. As far as the taunting goes on the website, I think what can be established is that that someone on this particular login taunted the parents. Now, was it done from this particular computer? If it was done from this particular computer, then that means either Michael Devlin did it, Shawn did it, or someone with access to the computer.
All right, well, that's a good point.
But he's also, I mean, let's not forget, he's a kid. He may be 15 now.
I'm not buying this. If you're a...
There you go. So again, you know, monumental ignorance, and again, no offense to people loving Bill O'Reilly, but you know, I put him in a closet, treat him like Patty Hearst was treated. I guarantee you 100% he'd be brainwashed as much as anybody else. It's a human beings can be brainwashed pretty easily. Some people more resistant to it than others, but especially kids. Especially kids. And again, we see case after case after case after case of this. And you have to ask yourself, why would a kid like this, why would they willingly submit to this kind of treatment? Why would somebody like Patty Hearst, be turned into Tanya by, these kind of things? The things that happen to them are extremely bad things. Okay, so again, I think it's a monumental ignorance. That's my opinion. You can have a different opinion, it's fine. But I find it shocking. Now, let's talk about reasons for Stockholm Syndrome. Let's get into some details about this. Why would captured human beings behave in this way? Okay. And for me, the most cogent answer comes from the field of evolutionary psychology. And there was an article by Cantor and Price in 2007 that looked at the evolutionary basis of Stockholm Syndrome and post-traumatic stress disorder, because these things are related to one another. And as they put it, the evolutionary theory of complex post-traumatic stress disorder is specific to those trapped in traumatic subordinate relationships. Traumatic entrapment includes people who are abducted and kept against their will, as well as children abused sexually or physically by adults, including their parents, over a period of time. So in other words, you can think of traumatic entrapment syndrome as something that's suffered by abused kids. Kids are abused, and they can't get away. So again, they also get these kinds of things, and post-traumatic stress is obviously one of them, and obviously some sort of Stockholm Syndrome is another one. How many abused kids will, claim to have, love for their parents or want to stay with their parents even though they're being abused? This is something that you see all the time. It's well known that victims experience post-traumatic stress resulting from their ordeals, and the stress can lead to personality changes and an inability to regulate emotional states, as well as a decrease in cognitive function. So these things have all been demonstrated. In both complex PTSD and Stockholm Syndrome, victims may idealize and have positive feelings toward their abusers. The authors make the case that this is a form of appeasement which confers a survival advantage in some mammals and primates who undergo traumatic subordination to a captor. Prisoners who appease their captors are less likely to be killed and are more likely to reproduce than captives who do not demonstrate appeasement behavior. Appeasement is seen as one of the 6 mammalian defenses which are exaggerated by PTSD. So again, it makes sense? The idea is that if you are kept, entrapped by somebody in a traumatic way, that if you appease your captors, you are more likely to live. If you're more likely to live, you're more likely to have children. Okay? Patty Hearst is a good example. She appeased her captors, fell into the Stockholm Syndrome. It's over. She's able to get married and have kids, right? So, again, this is part of the thing. So we are all descendants of people, of primate ancestors, who were more likely to live through appeasement. The ones who didn't do the appeasing got killed, didn't pass their genes on as much. So we are the ancestors of those who did appeasement. Okay? So this also is a personality trait that persists in the human population when under these traumatic entrapped conditions. Okay? And this is one of the reasons why it is relatively easy to brainwash people, especially kids. Because kids are trapped, kids are reliant on the adults. So for kids it's even worse. Kids are absolutely reliant on the adults. And if a kid doesn't have an adult taking care of them, they'll starve to death, especially in our primate ancestors. And so again, this appeasement becomes a survival tactic. Yes?
Okay, I want to preface this with saying I've never been in the military, but a lot of that seems reminiscent of Full Metal Jacket. The whole, they basically are breaking you down and brainwashing you because, the military is gonna...
Yeah, it's not exactly the same. But again, there is an aspect of anytime somebody is broken down into a system, where they are subordinate, there's a little echo of this. But it's not quite the same in the military, because the military is, they may be sort of abusing you on the surface, but they're not traumatically, And again, what they're really doing is getting you indoctrinated into the system. Right? You can say the same thing about people coming to university. You guys all came to university. You're here as university students now. There's certain things that are expected of you, right, as university students. You have certain expectations, you're gonna do certain things. If you don't do those, there's gonna be some kind of penalties. And there's a learning period where you learn those. We get a lot of people come in from, especially from community colleges, they get here, and they've been doing things a certain way, and they get here and they realize those don't work anymore, and there's a lot of negative things that happen, and then you learn to be subordinate to the system, right? You can think of the military as maybe a more, maybe a little bit more of a intense example of that, but that's not quite the same as what I'm talking about here. Yes?
Is a micro version of voice appeasing, it's kind of like in society, how in a hostile work environment, that people to kind of maintain, of course, their job,
Yeah.
maintain peace,
Yeah.
they just kind of like, okay, sure.
Yeah. You have a horrible boss.
Yeah.
Boss treats you really bad, abuses you in some way, and you don't say anything because you don't lose your job. Well, you're seeing this Me Too movement now. All these women are coming out, especially in Hollywood, right? It's horrible. And that's the norm for Hollywood, right? All these women, why didn't these women speak up earlier? Well, because they would lose their job, they would lose their prospects in the industry. They're not allowed to do it. So they just whatever, they appease. Now, not all the women had sex with these guys. Some did. You're not hearing a lot from the women who actually did have sex with these guys, and there's quite a few of them. But you're hearing from women now who maybe, were able to not resist to some degree or go somewhere else, like, what's her name? She's on the news a bunch now. What's the other one? I just saw her the other day. She was in Austin Powers. Oh, what's her name? First one.
Elizabeth.
Not Elizabeth Hurley. No, second one. Heather Graham, right? She's been talking a lot lately, she didn't succumb to, Harvey Weinstein. She said, Uma Thurman was on the other day. But these are women who, were able to make clear. The women who really felt really entrapped and really had to do appeasement are the ones who had sex with Harvey Weinstein. And you're not hearing a lot from them. They're probably embarrassed and ashamed, But again, it's this kind of a pattern. Okay. Now, the women and the cases I'm showing you here are much worse. Obviously, being locked in a closet and raped for 10 years is, a worse situation. Again, it's hard to say what's worse and what's not worse, but these are extreme cases. But the patterns are very similar. And human beings have these sort of defense mechanisms, if you want to think of them as what, and appeasement is one of these things. And so here's the 6 of these things. You can think of these 6, okay? And they're not just humans, these are also mammals you see these in. Avoidance of threats. Now that's easy. Avoid the threats if you can. Attentive immobility. Freezing and watching as a prelude to more definitive action. I see this every day when I drive into my house, and we have this whole herd of deer now. There's literally a herd of deer. I'm not exaggerating, it's a herd. And what they'll do, the car pulls up, they'll just freeze. Wait to see what happens, right? And then they'll do something. Withdrawal, flight response, just running away. You do that. Aggressive defense, fight response, okay? You'll see this one with raccoons, by the way. I highly recommend that you do not fight raccoons. They are nasty little buggers. They will fight you, even though they're a little small. That's their defense. They'll just fight, and they're really nasty, okay? And we have a lot of coyotes in our area, and raccoons get eaten. It doesn't always work to fight the coyotes because there's lots of them. And then appeasement. And you see this among primates. You see the primate, the big monkey's getting all mad, right? The other monkey will come up and start picking, grooming. Grooming behavior is a form of soothing appeasement, Soothing, appeasement, right? Appeasement, right? Calm down the big monkey, and then you won't kill that one. So you see it in primates, you see it in dogs. What do dogs do? The dogs are in a fight, right? One dog's winning, what does it do? Right? Exposing themselves. Saying, I'm no longer in a fight. I'm exposing my vital spots to you, right? And so, now I'm not a threat to you anymore. And then usually among dogs, the dog will not attack the dog who turns over and is showing appeasement, will not be killed, okay? Usually not be killed. Unless the dog has been raised in a crazy way, Michael Vick sort of situation, then we have a different thing. But that dog's crazy, right? But a regular dog will not do that. Wolves typically will not do that. Okay, so appeasement, you see this appeasement thing. And so one thing you can think of in the human situation, the similar kind of appeasement. And the last one is tonic immobility, playing dead. Confuses the predator by inhibiting attack reflexes and fooling them to think the victim is contaminated food. This is one of the preferred methods of dealing with predators if a bear is attacking you. This confuses the bear. A lot of times the bear will leave you alone if you play dead. If you try to do number 4 with a bear, you are in big trouble. The only person I know who's able to do number 4 with a bear is my karate teacher, who, as a young man, he's like in 80 now. He was a young man. He would go to the zoo and fight animals. And so he told the different animals. He said lions were chicken. He said the tigers were pretty tough, but not too bad. The bears were the worst ones. He said fighting the bear was really scary. He said one swipe of the claw, and you're dead, you know. So, but he would not recommend fighting bears either. The fighting bear, tonic immobility, play dead, curl up, play dead. You don't look like you're too appetizing if he thinks you're dead. Or if you're from Alaska, you can do number 4. Did I tell you guys about the Alaska woman? I was in Alaska. I was in a little town in Alaska, and I was having my cup of coffee, reading the paper, and there was an article in there. Bear comes into a woman's backyard, right? Grizzly bear. And these are not just any bears. These are huge, honking, grizzly brown bears that are really aggressive. And she was barbecuing in the backyard, barbecuing some ribs. Bear comes over, oh, ribs, helps himself. And the woman picks up a giant cast iron frying pan and goes and starts beating the bear with the cast iron frying pan. And the bear, goes away. And the police showed up and they said, ma'am, we really think, it's probably not a good idea for you to be trying to fight the bear. You should really just go in your house and just, get away. And she goes, why? I had a frying pan. So if you want to know why Alaskans are tough, Alaskans are very tough. Also, you want to know why Alaskans have a lot of guns? Because they've got grizzly bears in their backyard, right? Now, in a situation of traumatic entrapment, appeasement may be your only defensive option. And in these cases that I've shown you here, this is by and large true. I mean, the running away, withdrawal, can happen. Eventually, a lot of them run away. That's not really an option for them for most of the time. In apes, research has shown that victims will at times turn toward their attackers for comfort and safety. This is a term that's called reverted escape. And in chimps, the victim of an attack will have heightened anxiety and will engage in soothing behaviors such as hugging and kissing, grooming former combatants. These soothing behaviors show the dominant animal that the victim is subordinate and may be the prelude to Stockholm Syndrome in humans, especially female victims. As Cantor and Price note, hunter-gatherer women have been remarkably frequently kidnapped by opposing tribes with little likelihood of rescue. From an evolutionary perspective, defiance in such circumstances carries the prospect of death and the non-transmission of related genes. Submission and defection may promote genetic survival. This has been described as capture bonding. Okay? And so again, if you look throughout human history, this thing where you would go and you would raid another tribe or another village and steal the women away is really quite common. It also has the stealing behavior, by the way, also has another advantage in that it allows the gene pools to mix up. You're in a little village, you're isolated, people get kind of inbred, and so, going and taking, genes from this village and taking to another one, gives more mixing the genes, which is healthier. There are also a lot of human customs and cultures that have marrying out of the group as part of the culture, that you don't take a wife from your own group, you take a wife from another tribe, they take a wife from your tribe, done in a more peaceful way, but this sort of like kidnapping kind of thing, also occurs quite regularly, has occurred quite regularly. So again, this traumatic entrapment may have had, again, this sort of survival benefit. Okay? Now finally, the authors point out that appeasement is associated with fear and shame. And fear provides the motivation for defense. You guys know this case, right? This is J.C. Dugard. This was a recent case, and she was kidnapped as a young girl, kept in the backyard, and she was repeatedly raped by this guy and fathered, 2 children with him. And then, of course, he would take her around, and they would go to Berkeley. He was a religious guy, so he went to Berkeley to get a permit to go and preach on campus. And somebody thought there was one of the police officers thought something a little strange about these kids. And so they said, okay, we'll come back tomorrow and we'll talk to you more about the permit. And she went and did some research, and they actually separated her out from him and interviewed her, and it took a little bit, but after a while she said, I was kidnapped, and they were able to capture this guy and his wife who went along with it. And she is now trying to have a normal life. It's very tough. Very, very, very tough. And he and the wife are in prison for, I believe, quite a long time. So fear provides motivation for defense. Shame on the part of the victim, however, gives a signal that he or she is of no threat to the captor. In this way, shame may be the precursor to appeasement. Okay? So if you have to ask yourself, why do we feel shame? This may be the reason. We feel shame because it's a form of appeasement. And our somebody who is mad at us may realize that and no longer be a threat. That we're no longer a threat to them. However, shame is a very uncomfortable emotion, and victims may dissociate to avoid experiencing it. Okay, so we feel shame, we dissociate from the shame. Dissociation may help the victim continue to appease the aggressor. When the ordeal is over, the shame returns along with other aspects of PTSD. The victims of traumatic entrapment have a long road to recovery. And again, when you think about child abused kids who abuse as children, who grow up to have dissociative disorders or personality disorders like borderline personality disorder, which has a pretty good degree of dissociation in it, it starts to make sense. Okay, you can think of these kids who undergo this abusive parenting as having basically doing some sort of traumatic appeasement. They appease the parents by feeling shame, and they feel the shame, and then they dissociate because they feel the shame, and then that becomes a pattern for them, and then they end up to have either in borderline personality sort of dissociative defenses, or even in the case of somebody who's got dissociative disorder, like they just get extreme dissociation. Okay, so it kind of makes sense. So these things all sort of fit together. Okay, they all fit together, and they're related to our evolution. And again, these are not easy things to recover from. So these kids who undergo these traumatic entrapment scenarios, most of them do not do very well when they get out. I think Elizabeth Smart is, one of the exceptions, and it's possible Elizabeth Smart did well because she had very, very close-knit, intense family support and a close-knit, loving family. I think that may have helped her. Some of these other kids did not have that, and you can say they did not do very well afterward. We'll find out about J.C. Dugard. I don't know how she's doing now, but I imagine this is really tough for her. Okay. The good news for you guys going into clinical psychology is that you'll always continue to have clients, which is not a good thing. We hope today that we don't need clinical psychologists anymore. That would be great. You're not seeing kids who are abused or people who are abused as kids. It would cut your caseload down quite a bit. And that would be a good thing for society. But unfortunately, clinical psychologists will always be able to find work because of this kind of thing. Now, we can talk a little bit about understanding of groups in psychology. So I've given you a little bit of the evolutionary background, which is the more modern approach. But I will tell you that there's been a lot of study of groups, groups in psychology. And so there's been a lot known about group psychology, most of which is pretty consonant with the evolutionary viewpoint. Okay? Pretty consonant with the evolutionary viewpoint. Okay? What we know about groups. So I just mentioned a few of these really quickly. Of course, Aristotle talked about man being a social animal. In the late 1800s, a guy named Gustave Le Bon wrote a book called The Crowd, and he talked about the group mind and large groups and the primitive nature of the crowd, that people, when they're in groups, act more primitively. Groups are regressive, primitive, uncivilized. Group members have an increased strength of contagion, increase in suggestibility. So while it may be more difficult to sort of traumatically entrap one person and keep them brainwashed, if you get a group of people, it becomes easier to some degree, because people, when they're in the group, are they're less likely to use their discriminating intelligence and more likely to respond from emotions. And this is one of the things Le Bon was talking about. Le Bon, this book very much influenced Freud quite a bit. Freud was very influenced by this book. Another guy, William McDougall, wrote The Group Mind. He had similar conclusions to Le Bon, but he also thought the groups could also be an agent for change for the better. He saw some positive aspects of groups. But to be positive, groups need to be organized. Freud came along and wrote this book, Group Psychology, The Analysis of the Ego. It's an excellent, very interesting book. It was influenced heavily by Le Bon. Freud did not write about group therapy. By the way, Freud never practiced group therapy. Freudian group therapy comes along later by other Freudians, much later. But Freud was intrigued by the effect of the group on the individual. Okay? And this is something we're getting back to what we talked about in the beginning about cults. And group members have a sense of purpose and a leader. Ties to the leader are like being in love. The leaders are overvalued and idealized, and narcissistic love is given over to the leader. Group dynamics relate to the superego, the ego ideal, the inner image of what a person wants to become. This is relinquished, and the group leader's goals and ideals replace it. So people give up their own idealized image of what they could be or what could be, and instead they take on what the leader tells them. Group cohesiveness is related to libidinal ties to the leader. Again, the leader, you have sort of a kind of a falling in love with the leader. This allows group members to identify with each other. What do you have all in common? That you all love this leader. Okay? And you can go to a concert, right? People at the concert all feel bonded together for their love of, the performer, right? So Ariana Grande is performing, and everybody in the audience is talking to each other. Oh, how much we love Ariana, right? I just picked her out of that. I don't know. You would pick your choice, right? It could be it could be like a death metal band. Doesn't matter. We all love this band. Oh, we're all so into it, right? So they bond together. Regression in the group is overcome. Regression in the group. Sorry, a little typo here. Regression in the group can be overcome by emotional empathy, and this is what suggests the therapy. That you can regress in the group, but you can have this empathy with each other and with the group leader. You can have empathy with each other. You kind of see things from other people's point of view, and this can overcome the sort of regression in the group. And this suggests why group therapy may work. And by the way, group therapy very, very useful, very, very, very effective, and reasonably priced. So if you're thinking about therapy and you think, well, I can't afford to see an individual therapist, group therapy is a very, very good alternative, and I highly recommend it. Now, Freud never did do group therapy. The closest was his Wednesday night group of psychoanalysts. Over time, the group meetings became more and more emotional and finally broke up due to emotional conflict between Freud and Adler. And Adler, of course, went on to develop a group therapy. Freud never did, but Freudians later on did. But again, if you're in the group and you're not cognizant of it, especially if you're the group leader and you're not cognizant of these forces at work, then the group either becomes cult-like or it just becomes everybody sort of regresses and it falls apart. And this is the pitfalls of doing group therapy with people. Now, Freud also wrote this book in 1929, Civilization's Discontent, and he talked about two important ideas, sublimation and projective identification. Freud writes, men are not gentle, friendly creatures wishing for love who simply defend themselves if they are attacked, but that a powerful measure for the desire of aggression has to be reckoned on as part of their instinctual endowment. The result is that their neighbor to them is not only a possible helper or sexual object, but also a temptation to gratify their aggressiveness, to exploit his capacity for work without recompense, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause pain, torture, and to kill him. Homo homini lupus, which means in Latin man as wolf, who has the courage to dispute it in the face of all the evidence in his own life and history. So what Freud is saying here is that human beings have a tendency to treat each other poorly. Okay? We all have a little bit of hooker in us. There's always a little bit of us that is sadistic, and we like to make other people sublimate to our will, make other people subordinate to us. And this is something that we have to deal with as human beings. And the problem is if you're this kind of person and you become in charge of a group, you can get lots of people to do this, and this can also do all sorts of terrible things, right? And there's reasons why people pick leaders like this. Usually it's because they feel they feel very desperate. They feel somehow they have some narcissistic wounding. And so they'll pick a leader who thinks they can repair the stuff, but the leader will also demand this sort of level of sort of submission from them. Okay? And again, we see this again in political leaders. We see this all around the world. We see this, here. It's a typical kind of thing. So human beings are not really especially nice to each other. And so again, we can look at these extreme cases of traumatic entrapment, but we can also see less extreme cases in large groups where, this sort of entrapment is pretty typical. And there's always somebody willing to be the sort of abuser. Okay? And you don't believe me? Just turn the internet on and look at the news today. And you will find something in there where somebody is doing these horrible things to somebody else. I mean, you guys have been following the Syria stuff lately? This is just unbelievable that this is happening in the modern world. That, you know, that people are going out because of some political need or, political need to feel important, that people are, basically killing and torturing, men, women, and children. It's unbelievable, but it's a typical thing, very typical human behavior. Okay? And that people are willing to follow the Syrian leader and do these things, to people. You're willing to get in a plane and go bomb people or shoot people or lob chlorine gas into little kids and kill them in a horrible way. This goes on daily. Okay? It goes on daily. And so Freud recognized this. Now, Freud also talked a lot about the problem of civilization, how the demands and the desire of the individual can be reconciled with those of the group. And Freud links the discontent experienced by civilized human beings to the stage in the psychic development of the child. We don't need to go into these. We'll talk about this stuff in personality theory. But the important thing is that human beings have the capacity to sublimate energy. Okay? And that, you're a human being, you live in society, you have all these urges. You want to go out and dominate people, you want to rape them, you want to kill them, but you don't do that. I mean, it's great. I'm looking around the room right now. I've noticed, like the past few minutes, that nobody here has raped anybody else and nobody here has killed anybody else. It's really quite gratifying to me, right? Why would Freud say that is happening? Freud would say you're all sublimating your urges, your desires, your urges, your sadism, if you will. You're sublimating that. Well, why do you sublimate that? Well, because you are able to, first of all, realize that if you're able to sublimate these things, that better things will come to you in the future. Okay? Which is true. And you're all here in college. You're sublimating your urges in order to come here to college to learn, get a degree, and then do better for yourself. And for Freud, this is how civilization develops. That we don't act out our urges, we sublimate, and that energy then gets turned into basically building civilization. Building colleges, building libraries full of knowledge, even buildings, having a government that functions, having an infrastructure, that sort of tide floats all boats, right? So this is sublimation, very, very important. If you look at the examples we're giving here of people, these abusers, these are people who are not able to sublimate their urges. And you want to understand why somebody does these things, they're not able to sublimate their urges, not able to take their desire to put a woman under the bed and rape her every day. They can't take those desires and turn that into something else more positive, for whatever reason. Okay? And there's lots of reasons we could have a discussion about that. But the good thing for us is that we're able to do that. And again, the proof is in the pudding. I see everybody's behaving pretty nice right now. The problem comes with that, however, there's a problem with that. There's a price to pay that Freud talks about. And the price is that you don't get to satisfy your urges. You don't get to follow your urges. You don't get to get out there and kill something. You don't get to get out there and just have sex with whatever, right? You have to sublimate that stuff. And so Freud says, even though we live in this wonderful civilization where the tide floats all boats because we're able to sublimate, he says if civilization requires such sacrifices, meaning sublimation, not only of sexuality but of aggressive tendencies, we can better understand why it should be so hard for men, and he means men and women, to feel happy in it, right? So we're able to sublimate, but we're miserable because we never get to gratify our urges. And so we're these miserable people living in paradise, according to Freud. Now, Freud was not the happiest person when he wrote this. He was suffering from jaw cancer, which they couldn't give him any. He had to have 23 operations, which they couldn't use any anesthesia on. And he was, pretty miserable at this time of life. So this is a very kind of dim view of humanity. So just understand that, right? Dim view of humanity. Now Freud talked about another thing, and this is projection. This is an unconscious process where a person imposes subjective feeling or thoughts on someone, something, or somewhere. It's an unconscious process people do without awareness. In other words, I might feel a certain way, I may feel bad about certain aspects of myself, but I'll feel better if I can take those bad aspects and project it onto somebody else. Okay? And this is something that also relates to group psychology in that the leader can guide the projections for a whole group of people. So in other words, I have my cult here, we have a certain weird belief that comes from me as a leader, and what I can do is tell everybody in the group, those people out there are bad, so we're all psychology majors. Any sociology majors in here? One, uh-oh. So let's say, you know, we're all psychology majors, and we say, well, I'm the head of psychology, the psychology tribe. We're really good. Our stuff is great, but it's the sociologists. They're the ones who are bad. So we really hate them. All those things that, those negative things, that's all that's all the sociology guys have. We have all the good stuff. They have all the bad stuff. And then you guys all buy into the projection, and that strengthens your ties to me as the leader, because there's an outside enemy. Okay, there's an outside enemy, so we all have to stick together, so you guys stick together, and then you guys stick to me, and then we can be more coherent, right? But that also means that I can get you to go do very bad things. Well, we need to get rid of the sociologists. So we've got some special trains in the middle of the night, and we've arranged we're going to go there and raid them. We're going to put them all on the special trains in the middle of the night and send them off to the camps, where we're going to, evacuate them, right? Right? And this is exactly what you saw in Nazi Germany, right? You project all the bad stuff onto a group of people. In Nazi Germany, it was Jews, right? There was other people too, mostly Jews, but other groups are bad. We're all good. And you can preserve your own goodness by taking the badness and putting it out there, projecting it out there, and getting rid of it, literally, and then literally getting rid of it by killing people. Okay? And so this is something we have to be very careful about. And we find this now on our modern side. This happens all the time. Again, when you read the news and people are freaking out about, like, this stuff about Muslims, and we can't let Muslims come into the country and all this kind of stuff, people freak out because this is sort of the beginnings of that sort of process. And you have to be very careful about it. When you see white supremacists going around, this is you see the beginnings of that process. Okay? And people might say, well, who cares if the president comments about Charlottesville or whatever? Who cares about that? He makes some comment. Well, you care because you don't want this kind of process to develop. We're all the good ones. We need to keep the bad ones out. That's the scary thing. Okay? And we need to build a barrier. Right? Again, I talked to you guys about this in regard to narcissism, so you've heard that already, but this is the same kind of thing, group process. So Freud was very present. This is a very good book to read, by the way. I really recommend reading it. Both these books. Now, another guy came along, Bion, and he was a later Freudian English guy, and he wrote about group psychology quite extensively. And I used a lot of Bion's idea, and I wrote an article about psychopathology, groups, and group leaders. And again, the relationship among the group and the group leaders and the pathology. Okay? So again, this goes back, again, if we look at the sort of simple case, we could talk about traumatic entrapment. I didn't do that in the paper because I didn't know about that then. I just talked about it from a Freudian point of view. And I talked about it, actually this is an article I wrote that was published in an organizational psychology journal. The only time I ever published in an organizational psychology journal. And you can see the young picture of me there when I had dark hair. Basically what I talk about here is there's 3 types of groups that Bion described. Okay? 3 types of group structures and 3 types of pathology that go along with these. First is a dependency group. This is where group members perceive themselves as weak and inadequate. They're too incompetent and too immature to help the group achieve its goals. Therefore, the group leader is idealized and depended upon to solve the group's problems and attain its goals. The group leader knows all and is infallible. The group members desperately try and extract these qualities of the group leaders from themselves and are bound together by their neediness. When the leader fails to live up to the group's unrealistic expectations, they first react with denial and ultimately totally devalue him. The group members then to seek out a substitute to carry on the omnipotent projections of the group. Okay? And this is, a lot of times the leaders of the dependency group will be very narcissistic characters. Because again, they're the ones who are going to say, I'm the greatest, you should follow me, I know all the answers. So, I'm the best. And the group leaders really need that because they feel very insecure or very downtrodden. And so they will then project their needs on the leader who says, I will handle all your needs, I will take care of you. And as long as the leader does something, or at least keeps these guys convinced that he's doing that, they will continue to feed him all their adoration. If he doesn't do those things, however, then they will withdraw that stuff from him and they will substitute him with somebody else. So back in ancient China, this was known as the mandate of heaven. But you can see examples of this now. The next kind of group is a fight or flight group. This can be characterized by an esprit de corps that relies on the presence of a real or imaginary enemy outside of the group. Sociologists, right? The group shares a common ideology, does not tolerate any deviation. the group is the subject of the formation of subgroups which splinter off from the main group. These subgroups cause infighting among members of the main group. The group as a whole looks to the leader to keep the fight against perceived outside enemies and suppress the infighting and splintering into subgroups with the main group. So I'm the leader of the psychologists. I see you guys are fighting among yourselves. You're arguing over whether developmental psychology is better than clinical psychology. I come to you and I say, hey, stop it. I'm the leader. You guys cannot fight among yourselves because the sociologists are over there. We really got to like watch out for them. You know, they're really scary. So let's all stick together. Let's put aside our problems and like worry about the real enemy which is out there. And that's my job as the leader. Now this can also, pathological wise, this can attract people like malignant narcissists. Because the malignant narcissist is going to get their adoration by having you guys go out and get the other group. Kill them or maim them or do something bad to them, be aggressive toward them. That's why you show me your admiration. So this can attract your malignant narcissists. And the relationship between the leader and the group is characterized by control. As a leader, I have to control the followers. The last group is a pairing group. This is based on the projections of the group members onto a couple in the group. The couple symbolizes the ability to procreate and thereby to maintain the integrity of the group. The sexual union of the couple is seeing something that will save the group from its own internal conflicts, allowing group members to experience intimacy with each other and protection from the hostility and dependency found in the other two types of groups. So this sounds like the best kind of group, right? And this is the kind of group you have. You don't have to see this as much anymore. We have like countries that are run by a king and a queen, right? And they form the model for us, and their intimacy forms the model for us. And as the group, we all can kind of copy that intimacy and love each other in the group, right? The problem with these kind of groups is more difficult for them to get things done. So in an organizational setting, when you have, this is when you have the boss and you start sleeping with the secretary and everybody knows about it, right? What happens is members of the group pay more attention to that than they do about actually doing the thing that the company's supposed to do, like making a widget or designing something or selling something, right? And also, it allows people in the group, they feel like they have the freedom to start having intimate relationships within the group followers. And so people will start hooking up, and they'll start just gossiping about the, the boss and the secretary. They'll be hooking up, and the thing that they're supposed to be doing, which is working and making something or selling something, that gets put to the side. And so this can be a problem in a work group, and this is why a lot of companies have rules about having relationships among the people working in the company, right? We have that here too, right? There's professors not supposed to go out with students, right? Because what happens? What if I'm going out with some woman from the class here, and so everybody knows we're having a relationship? You guys go, oh well, she's just going to get, she's going to give her a good grade. You guys are gossiping about it all the time, or you're thinking, well, I guess it's okay to hook up in this class, and so you guys are hooking up, and then the role of the class becomes very secondary. Okay, so we have rules against this. Also, there's a power dynamic too, right? Because maybe this woman is, maybe I've decided to have a relationship with this imaginary woman here. I decided to have a relationship with her. Maybe we're really in love with each other, or maybe I am, dominating her, right? Maybe she's having a relationship with me because she's going to get something out. Maybe she's appeasing me. Not going to get a good grade, so there's appeasement going on. So all those dynamics come into play. So you have to watch out for those things. So pairing groups are ones that are a little trickier. Now, we don't see the pairing groups as much on the national political stage anymore. I think the closest you could kind of come to a pairing group, if you want to make it, I don't know if this is a good example or not, but you could think of like Barack and Michelle Obama. People like really look at their relationship as being really wonderful. And here's a president, a male president who didn't have a sex scandal and, come from 3 divorces and all this kind of stuff, and he loves his wife, and his wife's a very powerful woman, kind of his equal, and they hang out together. Everybody goes, wow, what a wonderful relationship, and they get things. And then you look and see, well, when they are the leaders, maybe things don't get done as much, right? Maybe, maybe people don't rally behind and get things as done. Maybe there's not as much activism, right? We don't pass gun control or whatever is going under the Obamas because everybody's so enthralled with that relationship. It's an idea. I'm not saying it's true or not, but think of that as an idea. So pairing groups, okay? Now what we tend to find is, fight or flight and dependency groups in sort of large group situations, especially political leaders and political groups, national groups. We tend to find dependency and fight and flight. And they can be mixed together. They are not independent of each other. Again, I'm presenting them as separate, but they can also be mixed together. And we tend to find some mixture of dependency and fight or flight in national groups. right? I mean, you all know, we're all Americans here, we all know that, you know, the enemies of America right now, right? You know, the fight or flight group, we all know who the enemies are, right? Unfortunately now we have two nuclear ones. North Korea, ready to send missiles at us, and now Putin is, you know, you heard the other day he's talking about all his missiles and stuff, so now we got real enemies out there, right? So we're all gonna bond together under these enemies and, you know, stick together and follow our leader, right? These things will cause us, you know, so again, you can see this even in American politics now, right? Yes?
Can two examples of the pairing be Bill Clinton and the royal couple of Britain?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the past you would have seen royal couples would have felt this role, right? You've seen royal couples would have been the ones who did this kind of thing, you know. But again, that could have been mixed in with other kinds of things. You could have a pairing group with a fight or flight group, you know, they would have been mixed together. You don't see as much couples ruling things anymore. It's not as quite as common.
The Clintons, can they do themselves?
The Clintons, I don't know. You can make a decision about that. I don't know if the Clintons, because I think as a couple, they don't have the intimacy, at least it's not on display that you have. And of course, Bill Clinton famously straying from, you know, from his marriage, you know, whatever, they have some arrangement, I don't know what it is. There's lots of different theories out there about that. I don't know. But you can make it, but again, it gives you a tool to look at these sort of things. Okay. And again, you can just ask yourself, is there such thing as mass Stockholm Syndrome, mass traumatic entrapment? And again, I give the Nazis an example, but you could think of less extreme examples of this. Okay, again, you know, your political thing, your group of friends, you know, whatever, you know, psychology major versus other majors, I don't know. But you know, again, I think it's worth thinking about.
Aren't like cults by definition?
Cults,
I mean,
cults would fit, yeah, cults fit this perfectly, this, yeah. Cults, but even things larger than cults, you can find this. Even things are a little more subtle, okay, because this tends to be a typical sort of pattern in human behavior, okay, especially in groups. Okay, yes?
You know, I know there's a common thing on the internet where they have Beauty and the Beast. Is that really Stockholm Syndrome or is it something else?
Could be. I mean, you know, the beast kidnaps her and eventually he stops looking like a beast and looks like a, you know, lovely young man. So, yeah, you know. Could be Stockholm Syndrome. Now, we could talk about ways that you can break through these things. That would be another topic for another discussion. You know, again, things like groupthink and things like this that go along with these ideas and how you break through those. One is to have a devil's advocate. Does he really look like a beautiful young man? No, he's an ugly, you know, mofo, like, you know. Oh, really? That seems like he looks like a beautiful man. No, he's ugly, you know. But you have that outside person who gives you advice. Sometimes it's hard to find an outside person.
Are you talking about the movie?
No, just the movie or the story, whatever. Yeah. All right, I think that's all I have to say. Unless there are any other questions? Yes?
So mass Stockholm Syndrome, if it's a society, like you said, possibly like Nazi Germany, then it would take the society as a whole to a long time to recover
Yes.
from the guilty feeling.
Yes. It took a long time. And the Germans, by the way, really addressed that after the war and really made a concerted effort to do that. The Japanese, on the other hand, never did that. And there's still some unconscious stuff down there, you know, very interesting. Yeah. Yes?
So one of us studies holistic things says that it is common to apply to so many years that someone under a certain abuse, maybe they abuse a drug or something, it takes that amount of years to heal from.
I would never make an algebraic statement like that. I think everybody's different. You know, everybody's different. Some people take forever, some people never heal, some people heal right away. I think it's really different, depends. Okay.